Welcome back to War, Economy, and State. This is the Mises Institute's Foreign Policy and International Relations podcast. I'm your co-host, Ryan McMakin, executive editor with the Mises Institute, and joining me is Zachary Yost, one of our foreign policy writers, scholars, guy I like to talk about foreign policy with. And we're going to talk, me and Zach, we're going to talk today about the National Defense Industrial Strategy. Don't turn it off. It's more interesting than you think. This came out in December 2023, and it's a lobbying paper. So if you've ever worked with government much, the departments crank out these policy papers. Essentially, it's masquerades as research of a sort, and yeah, some research is involved, but it's the department saying, okay, this is a thing we want to lobby for, so write up a paper that basically explains why this policy we want is wonderful and make it look like it's basically a research paper. Now, of course, lots of other groups do that too. The difference is that you're paying for this. You pay the Department of Defense to lobby for the Congress to spend more money on it. And this is just one part of that effort. And we'll link to this in the descriptions. And so you can go and read it for yourself. It's not terribly long. It's about 60 pages. And it's signed. It starts out with a forward signed by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, I guess, because the Secretary of Defense is in a coma or something. I don't even know what happened to that guy last time I checked. It's been in and out of the hospital, so he may or may not even be working. And so they put forward all of these 60 pages worth of stuff that are really in the service of explaining why the United States needs industrial policy in the service of more national defense sort of spending and planning. And industrial strategy is a term that's been around for years. It's basically central planning. Franklin Roosevelt loved the idea of industrial strategy, wanted industrial strategy. This is where the central government has a plan for, this is how much of these things we're going to make, and we're going to subsidize certain industries and pay other industries and protect some industries so that we have this mix of products and services that come out and suit what the central government wants. And that's what's in this paper. It's just modern industrial strategy. It's basically modern mercantilism, however you want to say it, where it's, hey, we need a whole trade and industrial policy designed to strengthen the central government and the state. So let's look at a few of the details then. So Zach, we might as well just start. Where should we start with this when we're reading about the need for more active industrial policy in America?
Right, yes. One of the report's greatest flaws, though it's understandable why it is not present, is it does not really address the crunch that the U.S. military industrial base is in at the moment in regards to waging a proxy war in Ukraine, giving weapons to Israel, supposedly pivoting to Asia to contain China and defend Taiwan and Japan, et cetera, we have a shortage of everything, basically, to the point where we have, quote unquote, borrowed a surface-to-air missile system from Japan so that we can send another one to Ukraine. And also we have to send some to the Middle East because Iranian proxies are just, shooting missiles off all over the place. So it's really an example of imperial overstretch. And now they're like, oh, gee, we need to start cranking out more stuff. And they don't address that, really. So that's annoying. But one of the things they do address that I think is a good place to start is that a major problem facing the military industrial base and manufacturing in general is that there's an enormous shortage of skilled workers, of welders and die makers and all those other sort of technical skilled jobs that go into manufacturing things. And I can attest to this. I live in Pittsburgh. There's still a lot of industry of various kinds, and My relative just received his certificate from community college for welding, had a job immediately upon graduating. I was working tons of overtime. And he has said, like, yeah, lots of people there are very old, basically. And you can see similar reports about this from, like, the Shell manufacturing plant that the government runs, also in Pennsylvania, out in Scranton, that basically everyone there is old. When the government was like, oh, gee, we just gave a third of our Stinger missiles, which are anti-aircraft man-pads, man-portable air defense missiles, to the Ukrainians, and they used them up in about 2 months. There's not really been an active production line of those for like 15 years or something. They had to, Raytheon or whoever had to bring people out of retirement to be like, we need to get this line up and running again. But anyway, so they accurately recognize that this is an enormous problem. And they note that they'll need 117,000 like manufacturing employees, additional manufacturing employees, just to meet the Navy's current tranche of nuclear-powered submarines in the coming like 10 years. So it's already literally hundreds of thousands of job shortages. And so their solution is basically we need to subsidize, programs to train industrial workers. And on the one hand, like you can see, oh, well, that would make sense on the surface. And they note, manufacturing has become sort of a stigmatized profession. But then if you ask, well, wait a second, why did that happen? It might be that the, hundreds of billions of dollars that the government has poured into subsidizing a 4-year college degree might have something to do with that. So it sort of points to Mises's concept. I'm blanking on exactly what he called it, but basically how when it comes to socialism and central planning, it's sort of a negative spiral of one intervention leads to negative consequences. Oh, we need another intervention to deal with those negative consequences. Oh, wait.
Well, that was his talk, middle of the road policy leads to
right.
socialism.
Yes, that's it. Yeah. So I think that's almost a perfect example of this. It's like, why should we be subsidizing career paths where there's enormous, incredible demand, even outside of working for government affiliated contractors and producers, etc.? So that was, I think, a key sort of contradiction there. And another, it's truly, insane how the idea of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion has infected seemingly all of society, but also all levels of government. They have a section there, which who knows if the authors even believe anything they say, well, in the whole paper, but in this section in particular, it's almost sort of like just signaling to the powers that be, like giving them what they want to hear, but it's like, we need more women and minorities working in factories. It's like, what? Women and minorities are free to go to community college for next to nothing and acquire, the needed educational skills to enter this profession. So, yeah, it's.
Well, it's a lot of portions of this paper, right? You can tell what a profoundly political document it is, where it says all the correct things in that. Oh, well, this is the part where we mentioned something. So we had, like in the old despotisms of old, where anytime you mentioned the prince's name, you had to follow it up with "May he live forever" or something like that, right? Now it's like anytime we mention DEI, we have to just quickly nod our undying support for this notion. And so, there's all sorts of like little kind of pro-government dog whistle terms in there, if you will. But let's just look at some of the vocabulary they use in here, right? And I think this leads into just the general discussion is the phrase industrial ecosystem, where it's this idea of, okay, we need all these bombs and planes. And so we need to make sure and cultivate, not just within the United States, but globally. We need to centrally plan what sort of industries are going to be available and how we're going to trade with them. And it's really just quite a sight to behold about, and we've talked about this before in other documents that have come out of the Department of Defense. There's no lack of ambition ever in these documents. They always imagine that the whole world is to be ruled from Washington and that they can plan everything out and accomplish all these amazing global goals. Never seems to actually work out that way. They do succeed in spending a whole lot of money. That is the one thing they are always good at. But this attempt to create this industrial ecosystem that's somehow managed from the center, obviously, this is completely contrary to anything that you would agree with if you are well versed in Austrian economics and the idea of the impossibility of central planning, because you can't know what the real prices of anything are. Documents like iPencil, which looks at the complexity, the international complexity of just manufacturing a single pencil. So you can just kind of imagine trying to plan then some sort of global policy around building a bomb. And that's just what this document is here for. And it's all to the service of, and here's the phrase they use, we need this industrial ecosystem, this global central plan to tend to the, quote, security of the U.S., our allies, and our partners, quote, unquote. Well, that means everything. I mean, so it's not just the security of the U.S., mind you. And it mentions this phrase more than once. It's not just even our allies, because as we've seen in Ukraine is not an ally of the United States. It's not part of any treaty with the U.S. It's not key to any special interests of the U.S. It's just a country that the U.S. government has decided it wants to prop up. Well, so Ukraine would be our partner, and not to be confused with an ally, like, say, the United Kingdom. And so you can see how this is just carefully worded to ensure that there is no corner of the globe that is free from our intervention, and that's why we need this global industrial ecosystem. So it's just, in terms of its political purposes, it's just macro. It's military. The term Bitcoin maximalist that we sometimes throw around. This is military maximalist. Just yet more of this out of the Pentagon.
And this report is explicitly modeled on the annual National Defense Strategy, which we talked about in an earlier episode. We talked about, I think, the 2022 one, but which you might recall in the intro, it literally says there is nothing beyond our capacity. And a common, they mentioned several times this event called the Last Supper after basically when the Cold War was ended, the whoever was the Secretary of Defense at that time had a dinner apparently with like tons of defense contractors and is like, yeah, we're going to reduce the defense budget in light of, we're now the unipolar power of the world with no rivals, yada, yada. And this keeps being cited in the document of like, oh, budget cuts to the military led to all this consolidation in production, which, yeah, that's another thing we have to talk about in terms of what the actual military industrial base looks like at the moment. But it's sort of absurd that they keep citing that, because I just checked before the show, and in real dollars, the defense budget is larger today than it was when the Cold War ended. Now, people will either because they are just ignorant or because they're just trying to be deceitful, will say, oh, military spending as a portion of GDP is less than it was. We're practically spending less than we ever have on the military. Oh, no. But this implies that somehow our defensive needs are tied to the scale of GDP and not, geopolitical, geographic, national interest concerns, which is just ludicrous. It's craziness, but they try and pull that trick as well.
And I can confirm, I run the numbers a couple of times a year. Let's just double check. Let's look at the Pentagon, and you can look at the Pentagon. You can look at say veteran spending, which I mean, veteran spending is just deferred Pentagon spending. It's what they use to recruit people and keep people in. But even if you just used Pentagon spending, yeah, if you adjust for inflation, even if you adjust for inflation, it's still higher now than it was then. So, yeah, let's just stop pretending that defense spending is somehow less, that it's bare bones, that we're trimming the fat. There is no such thing going on, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise.
Yes. And so I think this is an important point. In the document, it is correct to identify this as a problem, but I'm not trusting that the government can fix it. And that is, it's not the procuring, artillery shells or something, procuring fighter jets. It's not like there's just a million firms out there producing, or even have the capacity to build an artillery shell or a fighter jet. But basically, if I remember correctly, there's roughly 6 firms that do that the government basically buys the vast majority of military procurement from, in terms of, military equipment. I'm not talking about like food or gasoline or something. And so, of course, I mean, Raytheon or Northrop Grumman or Boeing, it seems, I mean, these companies are quasi government entities at this point. I think one can safely say this, of course, leads to numerous difficulties in terms of efficiency and not being gouged. It's like, who's going to bid lower when there's 6 firms? It's like, it's not not exactly, there's Walmart, Target, Kmart, Giant Eagle, a gajillion, grocery stores, varied in geography all across the country. Not the case for, F-35 production. And they note that part of the reason, there's a whole bunch of structural reasons why it's hard to expand. They keep saying, oh, we want to get smaller firms involved in, military production. And there's difficulties entailed in that, in terms of, we might not be able to secure capital investment to retool a factory to produce X if X is not going to continue to be produced after 3 years or something. But also, to become a government contractor is not a simple process. There's, enormous amounts of rules and whatnot, and I assume you probably need to hire lawyers or at least some sort of contractor to decipher them. And I know, at least for lots of non-military contracting, there's all sorts of requirements for like minority representation and all sorts of crazy things. So it's not like, oh, I have some manufacturing capital here, I'm going to bid on this contract. Bidding on the contract is enormously complex and can cost a lot of money in and of itself. So, of course, in typical government fashion, they say, oh, well, we should simplify that, but also we need to provide services to help potential contractors, decipher all of our Byzantine regulations. So it literally amounts to, we need to hire more bureaucrats to help people navigate the bureaucracy. That is what in the end it amounts to. And it's like, this is absurd insanity, just nutty, but not surprising for the government, unfortunately.
Well, the government loves that sort of thing. They're always talking about hiring people to help people get on welfare. Right? Like, they always want to pay them. The government wants to pay itself to hire people, to figure out new people and ways to give away more money to more people. It's this nice scam they got going, and it was just seemed, look, if you can't figure out how to apply for welfare, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. It's not that hard. You go to the food stamps website. I've been there. In fact, I've run the numbers to see if I qualify. I almost do. I have so many kids that my income doesn't actually need to be especially low. Um, and so this is all designed for you to take advantage of these programs. And I know for a fact that when it comes to grant writing and all of these issues with government procurement, there's already all sorts of information and helps. And all these nonprofits, they have classes for it. I know the Treasury Department already has all sorts of workshops and classes. I mean, this idea that this doesn't already exist. It's they're not inventing this idea; they're just expanding it even more with even more spending. Um, and so it's really just quite remarkable the number of new ways they have come up with to spend money in this at an even higher magnitude than has been the case in the past. Um, let's look at a couple of well, before we move on, I wanted to come back a little bit to your talk about the Last Supper, right? Because there's a historical component in this report, right, which lends itself to a very specific goal. So they've got this history in there. Oh, the Cold War ended and there was all this spending, and then we cut back spending. And it made it sound like we've never recovered, as you said.
Yes.
We've never recovered from the end of the Cold War in terms of spending. Obvious nonsense, easily disprovable, but something they love to say. But you can see that if you just keep reading, the whole point of bringing all that up is really to launch a new Cold War. It's, oh, look, the old Cold War ended. We scaled back. The new threat now is China. So we have to ramp up spending now to pay attention to this new Cold War, this new enemy. And we have to do X, Y, Z in order to box in China. So there's a whole historical narrative here that they're using to manipulate you, where they act like spending went away, that America was naive, that America was in some sort of isolationist mode for the last 30 years, and now it's time to really expand and get back to business. And that's just sort of the story, the myth, the creation myth underlying the whole report. So I just think that should not go unnoticed. And that's, of course, exactly what we would expect to see. But it's amazing how they put it forward just so unironically, as if this is obvious that they haven't been spending enough on military spending, and now they need to take more action. Let's get our act together, people. We've been just chilling for too long.
Right.
And I wonder how the last 20 years of war fits into that.
Right. The story they spin, it conveniently absolves the Pentagon of their, now in hindsight, obviously flawed sort of pivot to I can't remember what jargon they call it, but basically like contemporary warfare as they viewed it, which is like all warfare is going to be fighting the Taliban for the next, for the foreseeable future. Even competition between great powers will be waged using, proxy militias in remote deserts where American air power can just, unopposedly bomb them to oblivion.
Well, that had elements in both. Well, I know Donald Rumsfeld had this thing going for like the modern next generation military, and then there was a lot of talk of the over the horizon sort of military action, right? Where we'll just send cruise missiles over the horizon from the sea to kill all of these terrorists. So it was all this small scale, we're economizing now stuff, but that's all seems to be out the window, right?
Yes, obviously. And because of Ukraine is the, I think I have a piece in the National Interest that talks some about that, but so, I mean, it's hard to say to what degree this is even the real price because artillery shells are manufactured at government-owned factories that are operated by government subcontractors. But I suppose to the degree there is an open market in artillery shells, like internationally among NATO people and all that who use 155 millimeter shells, as of a few months ago, a single artillery shell cost about $8,000. Which is the same price, like this article was like, this is the same price as like a high-end NVIDIA graphics card, which are now, one of the most coveted items on the planet. And, it's also, and it's like this artillery shell will be loaded in a cannon and fired off and blow up. Whereas at least it's not a capital good. It's a good that's consumed in war. So it's, and you need tens of thousands of these shells every month. And the Ukraine war is relatively a low grade conflict. I mean, if, let's pull an economist move here and assume a can opener. If there was a conventional war between, Russia and NATO, and we just say nukes aren't used, the scale would be incredible. I mean, it would be beyond anything we can really comprehend at the moment.
Yeah, imagine Ukraine across an entire eastern front.
Right. Yes.
From the Black Sea to the North Sea, or maybe up to the Baltic, I suppose.
And in the Pacific as well,
Sure, right,
fighting over, what's that island called? I can't remember the island, but it used to be Japan owned half the island, and they called it one thing, and then the Soviet Union took the whole island back after World War II. But it would not be impossible to see a front there and all that. But anyway, yeah. So it's obviously not sustainable to pay $8,000 for a shell when you need millions of them. And why has this happened? Oh, because of a Pentagon screw-up about grand strategy and what the future holds. So this also just nicely says, oh, it's the government didn't spend enough money, not that our basic job of planning for the United States' defense needs, we screwed up. Which we can, as we've talked about before, we don't even need to be in NATO. We don't even need to fight Russia, yada, yada, yada. But just
we should
saying
note that
were to happen.
If the U.S. was geared on just defending the Western Hemisphere, it wouldn't need an endless number of shells to fight some land war in Asia. It's just, it wouldn't be something remotely necessary.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And they also they have a really crazy line where they're attacking China, and then they blame China for stealing U.S. manufacturing, where again they absolve the government of all of its regulatory and labor regulations that have kneecapped American manufacturing and all that. And so they blame that. But then they also say that somehow the trade deficit with China contributed to the national debt. They don't explain the logic there, but it's all like, I guess
they're not economists.
This is just like a line, probably like a red meat line, like, oh yeah, the national debt, China's fault. Yes.
Well, that's one of these like things like DEI. You have to mention it and act like, oh, we're solving the national debt problem here. And even though it has nothing to do with the larger purpose.
The $7 trillion spent on the war on terror did not contribute to the national debt. It's China's fault.
This is the land of personal responsibility. Everything's China's fault. People taking fentanyl, it's Mexico's fault.
That's also China's fault. Yes, it comes from Chinese labs. It's a plot of theirs.
Well, speaking of Latin America, right, there is some discussion of that issue in here, which made me think, of course, our discussion in the past of Monroe Doctrine sort of strategy, where, look, the United States, if it needs to have some sort of international defense strategy beyond North America, fine, focus on the Americas, who are all natural allies. Contrary to
treaty allies, I would point out.
Yes.
Everyone forgets that. The Rio
real
Treaty.
allies, not just quote unquote partners.
Yes.
And of course, obviously Mexico, right? It has a long border with the United States. And people forget. I know that anti-immigration people always like to act like, oh, these people have no concept of Western civilization. They're alien to the Western tradition. Yes, they're Christian. Yes, they speak a European language. Yes, they've had written Western-style constitutions for 200 years, but they have nothing to do with the Western tradition. I have no idea how people come to this conclusion. The reality, of course, is that these are natural allies, ideologically, demographically, linguistically, and so it would seem that you would want to cultivate an alliance there. And we've said that in our own work. And we've talked about nearshoring then, this issue of, okay, fine, you don't want to be heavily reliant on trade with China. Fine. But that's no reason to curtail trade with all of the countries of Latin America, where you should essentially have completely free trade, at least in my opinion. And they use a term in this report called friend shoring, which is, I think it captures what we were talking about in terms of nearshoring. It was like, oh, let's just have more trade with these countries that are friendly toward us. Now, of course, this report manages to put a sinister spin on things where it's not really about unilateral free trade at all. It's really just about planned trade and controlling these countries through a back door and that sort of thing. But the idea, of course, makes sense. Like, there's all these countries that are natural allies. Why not have much more trade with them? Okay, that makes sense. It would be nice, I think, if that was a real part of the agenda, if that was a real emphasis here. I fear that it is not. But at least that was a part of the report that I thought, okay, well, I mean, that's at least reasonable. I'll just believe it when I see it, because that it's really just going to be about treaties to control intellectual property and a lot of other issues. It's really going to be, well, Latin America, we want you to be our friends so long as we can somehow use you as a cudgel against China. Otherwise, we don't really care whether you live or die. But I do think that would be a great idea. Just, okay, you want more industrial capacity? Then focus on developing it in Latin America. Not in a central planning sort of way, but just allowing the free flow of U.S. capital to these places so that we can use their local resources to further develop this industrial capacity. But it's not going to be that open, but the idea is fine.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. It does make sense to, we already have a gajillion factories right across the border in Mexico. It seems quite, natural that they could be incorporated into the, I-pencil-esque military industrial production, structure of production and all that, for sure.
Well, and this guy, I guess, just kind of leads us to the last part of this then. I mean, just read the summary. I mean, if you have a sense of just how nothing escapes the attention of the Pentagon in terms of things they can control, things they can spend on. They, of course, use terms like, oh, we need to invest in small business. I've noticed that now on government documents, anytime you see the term, this has been true for about 20 years now, anytime you see the term invest, what it really means is spend taxpayer dollars. There's no actual investment going on. They want to really just expand and control everything. That's the takeaway from this document. However, looking at the sorts of things that they raise and what they claim are very central concerns for the U.S. government, what would be the real free market solutions here? I think that don't require central planning. We've looked a little bit about just expanding free trade globally. Tell us a little bit more about how, right, because you have mentioned, not just here, but in some other places, and I think maybe we just haven't, let's go into a little bit more detail there, where they've really regulated the United States to the point where it's not competitive anymore. I mean,
right, yeah.
They complain, oh, we don't have enough steel production here. Okay, well, why is that? It's not because foreigners stole it. They were able to get it because it seems American policy was to push heavy manufacturing out of the United States. That would seem to really just lead us directly to what the solution would be, right? Which is to deregulate these industries.
Right, exactly. Now, a good example is steel, because people point out that the Chinese government subsidizes their steel industry. It has immense overcapacity. I mean, they're throwing money down the drain, but they could, can churn out lots of steel. But people have run the numbers, and I recall reading, it's been a while, like 5 or 6 years now, but I know they have work on it. The National Bureau of Economic Research has crunched the numbers, arguing that part of the decline of the U.S. steel industry stems from sort of, unions and the labor laws they've secured and sort of, environmental regulations, yada yada yada, that has made the American steel industry not able to be as competitive as other competitors. And this, I mean, is true all over the place. And when it comes to manufacturing, if of course we don't want pollution, negative externality, all that, but so many environmental regulations go way beyond preventing these sort of negative externalities. I mean, so many environmentalists are sort of anti-human zealots who, if they don't favor humanity going extinct, they at least want us to return to being, living in caves, deindustrialize. So that obviously huge issue. And then also, of course, labor. And I mean, you can look at the car industry, not an area I'm an expert in, but it's pretty obvious. Look at the big three in Detroit. They're, in my opinion, going downhill. And every time there's a labor negotiation, it seems that the company and shareholders get screwed over more and more. Where are all the dynamic car companies at now? They're in the South. They're in Tennessee or Tesla in Texas and all that. With right to work states. I mean, just sort of a side rant here. I was in a union once, actually, the grocery store union. I forget what it's technically called, but it was a scam. I had to pay and more money out of my small paycheck to fund the union to lobby for a higher minimum wage, basically. And I would not have been in the union if Pennsylvania was a right to work state. We can look, union membership declining. It has continued to decline for decades because people, when given the choice to not be in the union, decide not to be in the union. So,
So what you're saying is if that this document should have said remove and repeal all laws that favor union labor and unionization. Because labor unions are a threat to national security. It would seem that if this document was truly objective, it would say that.
Yes. Oh, yes. That's we need to write that up. Yes. And also, it becomes even more convoluted when it comes to government procurement because there's even more rules and regulations. What HR has to do in terms of DEI and all those absurd things, and so many. I don't know the degree to which this happens in military contracting, but I know for federal government contracting in general, minority-owned firms have to, receive so much of the funding and all that. And as David Bernstein points out in his excellent book, Classified, which I've reviewed for the Mises Wire, this leads to all sorts of ethnicity laundering, where people, are to try to claim that they are one ethnicity or another, so that they can get favored government contracting sort of bidding positions.
Yeah, it's basically like a shell corporation where you put a non-white person in charge of that, and then pretend that that is the actual. That's who applies for the grant, even though the actual work is done by some other group separate.
Yes, they do that. And people just pull an Elizabeth Warren and are like, I'm, Hispanic or black or something, and I mean, there's cases have gone to court over it about like, what is this person's ethnicity? The government must determine this. It's all craziness, horrible incentives created by the government.
Just as a side note, I should note that I don't know if we've carried articles on this on Mises.org, but Brazil has the same sorts of issues. And this is like a whole industry in Brazil.
Right, yes.
Is basically manufacturing a non-white persona for yourself so you can get like into college and things like that. So, yeah, it's anytime you create these rules, you're just asking for people to break them. And that's what a lot of this federal contracting stuff. It's not even necessarily DEI related, right? Because there's all these extra hoops you have to jump through for labor and pay and all of this. And it just creates layer upon layer of new regulations. And Mises would have hated that. We talked a little bit before we came online, right, about how in his books on intervention and a couple other places, Mises, who was not at least later in his career, early on, he was much better on foreign policy. Later in his career, was not a Rothbardian on foreign policy. But even he was like, look, you want these weapons manufacturers to do all this great stuff, and yet you regulate them out of existence. And you make it so that they offshore. And so if you actually claimed to be so concerned about military affairs, you wouldn't be asking all of these extra hoops of the defense industry and the weapons manufacturers. So even back in the 40s and 50s, Mises was well aware of this and had pointed it out. But as with everything, weapons manufacturing, it's all anything that the federal government touches becomes politicized. So you can't just have a contract with someone to make a bunch of bombs. There has to be environmental stuff. There has to be labor. There has to be DEI, all of that. You can't just let the market function, even when that would be key for your alleged goal of just unadulterated national defense. And yeah, that's just the way federal contracting works.
Right. And if you have your handy-dandy pocket edition of Human Action available, starting on page 817 is Mises's section on the economics of war. He also talks about it in Nation, State, and Economy, and elsewhere, as we've said. Basically, the basic point is we know people will say, oh, during peacetime, free markets are the way to go, but during a war, then we need central planning. It's like, points out this is obviously contradictory. If free markets is the most efficient way to produce and procure goods and services, why, if, this war, whatever war, is supposedly so important, so vital, perhaps existential, why would we then throw out this useful tool to then adopt a less efficient means of command economy? And a really short essay that I really, really like is The Economics of War by Murray Rothbard, where he sort of delves into this similarly. And like Mises, which we've talked before about his sort of address in like 1918, where he's talking about war financing in Austria-Hungary. He talks about that also in Nation, State, and Economy, and in this Economics of War section on Human Action. And Rothbard addresses this in the Economics of War, basically. What is the best method of war financing? And he, of course, just says, we don't want the government. If this war is truly important, the last thing we want to happen is the government to, just be gumming up the works with all of its, horrible economic central planning. And I think that, if there's any nerds out there who are looking for a project or something, a thesis or something, I think that trying to apply these Misesian and Rothbardian and generally just, sound economic insights to the American military industrial base would be quite a worthy use of your time, and it would yield many insights that would be beneficial for making our case. So definitely someone do that.
All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of War, Economy, and State. Thank you, Zach, for joining me again. We'll be back next month. We'll come up with a new topic. I'm sure there'll be plenty of horrible things said by the regime between now and then, but maybe we'll come back and talk about Ukraine next time, because I noticed that everywhere I look on the map in Ukraine, the Russians are advancing. And it seems that we've moved way beyond the days of the Ukrainian counterattack. And I don't know what the next phase is going to be now. But that may or may not be the topic for next time. Either way, we'll be back in a month, so we'll see you next time.